I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone to this autumn 2022 episode, as it were, of our Friday Forum. And we are very pleased indeed to be joined today by Dr. Chris Dromey. And Chris is an associate professor in music at Middlesex University, London. He is a very active music scholar in many areas and has published widely on topics such as Stravinsky, music copyright, classical music in nightclubs, which sounds very intriguing, the classical music industry, of course, and classical music competitions. And in 2013, Plumbago published his monograph, The Pierrot Ensembles, Chronicle and Catalogue 1912 to 2012. And this brings us rather nicely, in fact, to the topic on which Chris is going to be talking to us this afternoon, namely Peter Maxwell Davies's association with the Pierrot players and the fires of London. He will, of course, be talking about other things too. So I'll pass over now to Chris to introduce the session. So thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Nick, for that generous introduction and indeed for inviting me this afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak with you all about topics that we all have a passion for. So I will share my screen. I have, of course, a PowerPoint for you, and we have some music to listen to as well. As Nick said, the subject is a little broader than Max alone. I'll be sort of situating Max into the context of the Pierrot ensembles. I'll be explaining what a Pierrot ensemble is for you. I'm sure many of you will have guessed that there is a link to Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire and indeed to Maxwell Davies's Pierrot Players and the Fires of London, but we'll look at that in quite a bit of detail over the next 40 minutes or so. So today's subject, yes, develops research that I've been working on for quite some time. Nick and I were reminiscing a moment ago about a conference in 2004, I think, in Canterbury, where we were speaking about the Pierrot ensembles and about Max and about his accomplishments. And since I finished the book that Nick mentioned on the Pierrot ensembles, I wrote that to mark the centenary of Pierrot Lunaire. Sort of. I did a PhD and thought the centenary is coming. There's a marketing opportunity here. So 1912 to 2012, a history of Pierrot ensembles. And we all know, don't we, that Maxwell Davies's accomplishments and achievements in that medium are huge. And I'll be explaining how and why. But since that point, since 2012, occasionally, sporadically, I've been looking at what we might call offshoots of the ensemble. So directions the ensemble took in different countries at different times and the intercultural context that motivate them. So Pierrot ensemble can mean different things to different audiences. And this was one of the book's leading themes. You've got Schoenberg's ensemble. I shall share my screen now with you because we have got some definitions that we'll be dipping into. Don't worry, I won't be reading from the PowerPoint, but so I'll let you digest it in your own time, or you may even like to watch it back. But we do, of course, have Schoenberg's famous ensemble of speaking voice, flute doubling piccolo, clarinet doubling bass clarinet, piano, violin doubling viola, and cello. So that's the archetypal Pierrot ensemble, of course. But although literally hundreds of composers have written for a lineup similar to Schoenberg, incredibly few have written one identical to his. Much more popular, as we will see, is either a streamlined Pierrot quintet, so without the voice or the doubling, or what we, especially in this forum, might call a Fires sextet, thanks, of course, to Maxwell Davies and Harrison Birtwistle deciding to add percussion to the lineup in 1967. There were actually three percussionists at the Pierrot Players debut concert in 1967. I've got a slide later on. Harry's wife Sheila joined Tristan Fry, who was the percussionist, and Steve Pruslin, the pianist, on percussion for Max's Antichrist, which we'll listen to a bit later on. But even this is only part of the story. Three variants we've looked at already, Pierrot ensemble variants, of around a dozen that we'll encounter during this talk. So here are the basic definitions. We can call a Pierrot ensemble a work, such as Pierrot Lunaire. We can also call the performing ensemble a Pierrot ensemble. But the the takeaway, the overriding conclusion that we draw immediately is that it is a principal lineup for modern music, very much one of the archetypal modern music genres. We can also take away the fact that composers have been incredibly galvanized by Pierrot Lunaire and by its successors. And there is a strange history whereby composers have been motivated to act. And that isn't just Max and Harry, it's also Schoenberg himself, who went out to be an ambassador for Pierrot, commissioning companion works to his Pierrot Lunaire by Hans Eisler and even Anton Webern. And we'll listen to his arrangement, Webern's arrangement of Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony later on. So ever since Schoenberg wrote Pierrot Lunaire, it's been a touchstone for an astonishing number of composers, performers, critics, and musicologists. Its various national premieres began in Berlin. On to our next slide, with Schoenberg at the helm of an ensemble fronted by the work's commissioner, Albertine Seemer. But by the beginning of the 1920s, Pierrot Lunaire hadn't been heard anywhere since the outbreak of war. But over 4 short years, its notoriety inspired premieres, revivals, and tours in the US and across Europe. You have here the New York premiere, 1923. But a year before that, Milhaud conducted the French premiere in 1922, and he brought 2/3 of his Pierrot ensemble to London a year later for the British premiere. Varese co-founded the International Composers Guild to stage the American premiere after hearing a performance of Pierrot in the Berlin flat of Busoni. Alfredo Casella, who was himself an ICG member, attended that New York concert and brought Pierrot to Italy in 1924 and launched another new music society, the Corporation of New Music. So there's already a pattern emerging of new music societies, companion works, and composers specifically spurred into action. And that carried on. The American premiere that you can see there inspired a follow-up concert. The League of Composers was formed in 1925 for that concert, and that was attended by Gershwin. And weeks after that, we have Pierrot reaching Spain, a premiere held in Barcelona thanks to Roberto Gerhard, who arranged a Viennese-themed music festival there. So this concert's history, which is interwoven and transatlantic, reveals a time when new music cooperatives were flourishing and international cooperation was renewed. National fault lines didn't vanish overnight. Schoenberg and Casella had a big argument, a big falling out over their own respective traditions. Casella called Schoenberg's art so alien to our Italian temperament. And Schoenberg then wrote an article castigating him. So there was still, these national fault lines. But as though Pierrot was somehow failing by the revered standards of Italian drama. Nevertheless, across cities, countries, and continents, a cycle of anticipation and reaction had attached itself to Pierrot Lunaire, shaping the music as divisive yet momentous. Here is a selection of some of the initial responses to Pierrot Lunaire, to these concerts that I've been talking about. I think Percy Scholes' response sums it up really well when he says, Pierrot's very great power compels respect, even when it provokes dislike. I'd suggest that still holds true. So these reception and concert histories help explain how Pierrot became such a phenomenon. And it's one that, as we know, has been freighted with all kinds of meanings in the areas in which its fame or infamy, perhaps, have been gained. Expressionism, music theatre, the commedia dell'arte, melodrama, vocalization, instrumentation, deconstruction of the song cycle, perhaps, satire, definitely. That's just to name a few. But a further consequence of the story is that even by the mid-1920s, many more musicians than had been recruited by Schoenberg in 1912 had performed the work. Pierrot's instrumentation elevated it as a piece that would epitomize modern music making. It obliged fresh groups of players to come together, and it often led to new and enduring groups being formed on or around Schoenberg's ensemble. Fast forward to today, and the Pierrot ensemble has become a principal lineup for modern music. In Europe, well, there's Safa in Britain, in this country. There's Pierrot Lunaire Ensemble Wien in Austria. Spain has Grupo Enigma. Italy has Piccolo Accademia della Specchi, the Little Academy of Mirrors. Elsewhere, Australia has the Syzygy Ensemble, among others. In the US, the list is long, but includes Lunatics at Large, Da Capo Chamber Players, and the New York New Music Ensemble, here performing 8 songs for a Mad King. Probably most prominent of all, Eighth Blackbird, for whom Steve Reich overcame his objections to the Pierrot Ensemble by scoring double sextet for it in 2007, albeit he writes it against the pre-recorded version of the Pierrot Ensemble. He had said, I can't write for an ensemble like Pierrot Lunaire. That's not me. Nevertheless, he did. And we're going to hear the last minute of it, double sextet. So it's striking, I think, that the Pierrot Ensemble has withstood or tolerated so many variations to its identity. I think clearly this is a feature of modern constant presentation and of modern composition more widely. It speaks to the rebirth of music theatre, for which Max and Harry were very much responsible, co-responsible in this country. It also speaks to the waves of expressionism and neo-expressionism that we've seen in the last few decades. It also speaks to the coupling of new and old music, and that was something that Maxwell Davis was obviously very passionate about with arrangements, and Birtwistle too. We must credit his role. If I know I shot through the different photos, but one immediate conclusion we can draw is that they look very different, these ensembles, don't they, in the way that they're actually performing. Nevertheless, there is a debt here to the Fires of London. Any Pierrot ensemble that comes after the Fires of London has a debt to them, because they were. We'll return to what set the Pierrot players / Fires of London apart later in this talk, but you can see straight away that we have a very exuberant, branding. Sorry to use that word, but performance of Pierrot Lunaire in this country, at least before then, was nothing like this. There were very few performances, for one thing. At the risk of being modest, I've tracked them all in my book. There are only 5 or 6 from 1923 to 1950. Very sporadic, but every time there was a performance, interesting things would happen. And we'll look at that lineage in a little more detail in a few minutes' time. But looking at roughly 900 works for Pierrot Ensemble, and again, I know there are thousands really, but of the 900 I've looked at, the Fires of London and their Pierrot player predecessors were responsible for 88. I have taken the very subjective, but hopefully musicologically informed decision to categorize the Pierrot Ensemble as follows, into 12 subcategories. A few of these categories, for geographical or aesthetic reasons, have evolved to become more popular or more standard than others. And I think some other categories can and do tell stories around the localized traditions that have grown around the lineup. I mean, the grandest tradition of all, of course, is the significance of Peter Maxwell Davies, who did most to revive Pierrot Lunaire in Britain, but also to introduce new forces and characters with the tripled and quadrupled winds, the electronics, the dancers, the guitars, the marimbas. I mean, this slide here tries to show does show, I think, his legacy, or his huge contribution to the medium. And it's got some immediate anomalies, such as category 8 with guitar, because of inviting Tim Walker to the ensemble in 1971, I think it was. A work like Tenebrae Super Gesualdo is one of the leading works in that category. But there are others. I mean, if you look at category 4, which is, so I'm going to flick back now, without voice, but with instrumental doubling. That's surprisingly rare. Yet one of the earliest works by Hans Eisler, 1924, a work called Palmström, which was commissioned by Schoenberg as a companion to Pierrot. That nevertheless belongs to that subcategory. Number 9, again, forgive me, I've not done this very well. Number 9, which is with piano omitted. No, it's not. Yes, it is. With piano omitted or substituted for percussion or harp. That is another prominent subcategory. But also, I didn't mean 9. I wondered what I was talking about. Number 11, sorry, with dancers and or extra musical characters. Well, one of the most famous Pierrot ensembles there, of course, is Davies's Vesely Icones, a very sober work. I'm sure some of us know it, but if you don't, please seek it out. It's a very beautiful but sober work based on Stations of the Cross. And although, again, Davies was the first one to write a work like that for the Pierrot players, it was actually Birtwistle who wanted to adorn who first came up with the idea of having a dancer alongside their performing group. We are going to have a quick listen now. Here, by the way, is just an expansion of the graph, much more user-friendly, showing you a few of the works that belong to these different categories. They are very diverse. I mean, they're across years and across styles. But let's have a little listen, because why not, to Weyburn's arrangement of Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony. We'll just listen to the first minute or so. This is a Pierrot quintet. I know that's a criminally short extract, but you can look it up yourself, of course. And it's a very beautiful arrangement. I want to tell a little bit of the story about more of the lineage, before Max and Harry. So after Eisler and Weyburn, the lineage of Pierrot ensembles gathered pace pretty slowly at first. A young Benjamin Britten was making his way as a film composer when he wrote 3 British Commercial Gas Association documentaries, and he scored them for Pierrot Ensemble in the mid-1930s. In 1940, again for film, Eisler wrote his second Pierrot Ensemble, 14 Arten den Regen zu beschreiben, 14 Ways of Describing Rain, subtly changing the line of again. He didn't want any doubling between parts now, and he scored the violin and viola separately, but they never heard together, which is quite telling. It wasn't actually unknown around this time for Pierrot to be performed by a separate violinist and violist. It's not something you tend to see these days. These ties to performance history affected Benjamin Britten, who'd heard Pierrot broadcast from London in 1930 and saw it live there in 1933, as much as they did Elizabeth Lutyens, who wrote this work, Concertante for 5 players, in 1950, almost certainly inspired by Eisler's Pierrot Ensemble, because she'd heard it at the ISCM Festival in Palermo the year before. This is, in a sense, quite a rudimentary serial work. I mean, you're probably looking at the drones and thinking, how can it be serial? But it is. It's got the 12-tone row going through with the Ds there. So it's quite basic in one sense, but I hesitate to say it because it's very beautiful. It doesn't matter that it's quite basic technically. It's a very beautiful piece of music. Now, this, of course, is 15 years before the Wardour Castle Summer Schools that Nick mentioned at the start, when that was where Max and Harry and Steve Proslin and colleagues decided to form the Pierrot Players. But I think it's quite interesting to fill the gaps in history here. And here we have, forgive me, your faces are all in the way. Let's minimize you and me. Here we have the circumstances of the Concertante for 5 players premiere. Forgive me, I can't see the year. Is it 19? Because of Zoom. It says 11th of February. I've got a feeling this is 1951 or 1952. No, 1952. There we go. So we have here the London Symphony Orchestra Chamber Ensemble, and there were some important precursors to the Pierrot Players and the Fires of London. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that those ensembles, they include the likes of the Vesuvius Ensemble, the Virtuoso Ensemble, which were an offshoot to the London Symphony Orchestra Chamber Ensemble, and the Melos Ensemble, of course, probably most prominently. I'm not suggesting that they contributed as nearly as much to the new music of the Pierrot Players and Fires of London, but they are important precedents in terms of existing in Pierrot format before the Pierrot Players. It also helps us, I think, if we do look at their achievements, it helps us understand what did set the Pierrot Players apart, and that's what we're going to do now. The Pierrot Players' breakthrough in 1967, their inaugural concert, which you can see here, that was significant enough, of course. You've got here, Antichrist. This has endured, clearly, this work that we still know and is still taught to students up and down the land. But what did set them apart was regularly performing Pierre Lunaire. The number of performances they did in the first 18 months of their existence easily outstripped those that existed in this country before them in number. What also set them apart was, of course, the number of new works for the Pierrot Ensemble that they wrote within the group, but also commissioned beyond the group, supporting younger composers, supporting international composers even. Morton Feldman's Viola in My Life is a prominent Pierrot Ensemble from around this time. I think it's 1970. But there are many others, and we'll look at them in a moment. Davis has tended to take most of the credit for this, but this is largely because Birtwistle left the group in 1970. My book does have a chapter devoted to Birtwistle's contribution, and there is I think something of a corrective here to be had. I think Proslin's quote on the group, sorry, I didn't dwell on it, but he said that the difference between the Pierrot Players and what came before is that they would rehearse properly. They'd commit to the cause. It would be an adventure for them rather than a chore. And I think that quote is beautiful and very telling. It's an implicit criticism, I think, of the musical scene at the time. And when I read that quote, I was immediately reminded of other anecdotes I'd seen of foreign musicians, non-British musicians coming over as they did, as I've told you already, and encountering problems with British musicians, frankly. There are tales of Irving Stein getting very irked by the British musicians that he was trying to, get to learn this really hard piece of music. There are these flashpoints that recur through different musician biographies. Conversely, Peter Maxwell Davies claimed that his group held over 50 rehearsals before making this debut that you see in front of you. They transformed Pierrot into their semi-theatrical archetype, and that was a very groundbreaking decision. When Davis started writing works of music theatre to accompany and then replace Pierrot in concert, costume props became integral. The nun's habits of Davis's Missa Super L'Homme, for example, in which Mary Thomas played a disaffected priest, long before the days of women priests, of course, are very much in the masquerade tradition of Pierrot. It wasn't all plain sailing for the Pierrot players, but Whistle's monodrama here was a flop, and like several of his Pierrot ensembles, it was quickly withdrawn, even if it did set the tone for the group augmenting the Pierrot ensemble, and doing so theatrically, hence the quadrupled clarinets and the alto flute that you can see listed here. We're going to just listen to the final minute of Antichrist, because that's where the source kind of hoves back into view. So let's have a listen to that. If I can get to it, here we go. Two further examples from the Pierrot players' canon will follow. So this is a really interesting concert that I chronicled in my book, A Garland for Dr. K. I mean, I say that as though it's anomalous. It's not. It's the world premiere of 8 songs from Mad King, so it is pretty well known about. It's just that I never knew before I encountered this that it was such an interesting concert in itself. It was held in honor of Alfred Kalmus, who founded the London branch of Universal Edition in 1936. This is why the Garland, this anthology of pieces, is so star-studded. The concert is best remembered probably for 8 songs for a Mad King, which is I know we all know this, but I'll just say it for the record. Davis's stark, heart-rending account of King George III's derangement, a Pierrot ensemble that marked a new peak in his exploration of melodrama, parody, and multiphonics. Emulating Schoenberg's original lineup is not common, as we've seen, nor for that matter is the use of voice at all, even with percussion added. The 8 songs then, casting King George III as this alienated protagonist rather than Pierrot, are a rare example of taxonomy and aesthetic overlapping, suggesting something genre-based at play. I think this feeds into why the 8 songs were so successful and still remain so. Indeed, the 8 songs instrumental theatre came with a kind of Pierrot-esque confusion of narrative, structure, and dramatic personae, epitomised, of course, when the king smashes Duncan Druce's violin moments after quoting from Handel's Messiah, and by the song's final twist when the Mad King announces his own death. We're going to, just for fun, we're going to listen to Berriot's arrangement of Henry Purcell because it's only a minute long. This is part of the Garland in which the 8 songs were premiered. A year later, Birtwhistle's Spring Song concert, which you see here, took its cue from Schoenberg's Society for Private Musical Performances by banning applause and experimentally redefining the very idea of a concert. The idea here is that it has a symmetry about it, hence the interludes, hence where the interludes are programmed. Julie Kendrick's chess piece was performed during the interval, so there is a conceptual symmetry to it. It was also a very collaborative affair. David Hockney contributed art. Will Alsop staged the event. Hugh Davis, he invented the so-called shozig, an electronic instrument which was used in the evening's centerpiece, Birtwhistle's Medusa, another Pierrot ensemble that was withdrawn. Its revised scoring for soprano saxophone showed that, like Davis, Birtwhistle was writing for his Pierrot players, not just the Pierrot ensemble. It was Alan Hacker's suggestion to double the clarinet in this way, and it's an important precedent given its starring role in Birtwhistle's The Triumph of Time. Yet, tellingly, the full extent of Medusa's polystylism is not reflected in Birtwhistle's memory of the piece. And the same, quote, amusing tonal references, end quote, that so pleased one of its first critics probably proved its undoing. It's Birtwhistle's parody of a Bach chorale, coupled with fleeting allusions to a toccata and a jig, were highly uncharacteristic of Birtwhistle and more typical of Davis, and they would soon be disowned. Now, researching Birtwhistle's Pierrot ensembles was not easy because he didn't want to talk about them and they've been withdrawn, which is fair enough. But as I've been speaking to another musicologist recently, and it's actually almost impossible for a composer to actually withdraw a work. We can respect their wishes, we can not perform it, but I wanted to know more about Medusa. So the way I did it was listening to an old Radio 3 program in the British Sound Archive and then consulting its score in Basel and trying to somehow keep the two in my head, despite being in different countries. I did, though, come across an interesting documentary in which Birtwhistle spoke about Medusa. And we may be able to listen to a snippet of that documentary now. He didn't just speak about Medusa, but he also, there's bits of Medusa in the background. So we'll have a little bit of a listen to that now, just a minute or so.
Things like this have always interested me. I can't actually give a reason why. I don't think I really need to have to give a reason why. Medusa is one of the names for a jellyfish. And it occurred to me that certain things in the form of the jellyfish was like the piece that I was writing. A small segments of symmetrical movements. I have a pure...
Oh, sorry, we shouldn't have gone to that just yet. From 1970 to 1987, the Fires of London, the successor to the Pierrot players without Birtwhistle, generated a huge number of works for the lineup, especially as their international stature grew. They toured Europe, Australia, and the Americas. They collaborated with the likes of Elliott Carter, Sculthorpe, Henze, Finnessy, and Boulez. You might have spotted some of their works in the catalogue earlier, the two slides. The new group's lineup would be subjected to greater variation than before. Davis and dozens of other composers tinkered with the Fire's instrumentation. Where once the harpsichord or honky-tonk piano was used to extend Schoenberg's ploy of doubling, or to replace the piano altogether, now the guitar or the marimba might adorn the group. This is why the aesthetic and timbre of two of the most influential Pierrot ensembles around this time, Davis's 8 Songs and Davis's Ave Maristella 6 years later, sound so different. The Fires helped proliferate the Pierrot ensemble in the United States in particular. Carter and Feldman we've mentioned, Joan Towers, Mario Davidovsky, John Harbison, Donald Martino, Arthur Berger, Robert Keir, Ronald Caltabiano and many other American composers were beneficiaries of the links with the Fires, writing works for Pierrot Ensemble around this time. Stephen Mackey and Michael Torkey give their account a very common American view of the lineup in the 80s, thanks largely to the work that the Fires did. It becomes this ubiquitous new music ensemble. And it's the legacy, it's the Fires' legacy that I want to finish with. By way of an epilogue to this talk, I'll just say informally first that when I was finishing the book, I did a catalogue of Pierrot ensembles, and there was one work in there by Claudio Santoro called Musica de Camera, Brazilian composer, and it was 1944. And I thought, oh dear, because I think I was about 3 days away from submitting my PhD, and I was coming across this work that sort of contradicted the whole narrative, this British-led narrative of Pierrot ensembles with Benjamin Britten, all the performances, and Elizabeth Lutyens. So I couldn't do anything about that. I just had to submit the PhD, but I promised myself I'd look into it, and I did. And later on, I realized, I discovered that there was this localized tradition of Pierrot ensemble in Brazil. Now, we still don't know when Musica de Camera by Santoro was premiered. We're not even sure it was. We're not sure it was in the 1940s. We know it was performed later on, because he wrote it as an appendix to a music journal, strangely. So we're not sure whether it was performed in the 40s or 50s, but we do know it was performed later on by a work called Grupo Novo Horizonte, who began life in 1988 as a Pierrot ensemble, and were conducted by Graham Griffiths, an Englishman. Well, sorry, Graham. I think he's Welsh, a British musician. So by way of an epilogue to this talk, I'd like to talk briefly about Grupo Novo Horizonte, the New Horizons group. And we know that the Fires of London disbanded in 1987, and it was only a few months earlier when the British musicologist, clarinetist and pianist Graham Griffiths relocated to Sao Paulo. He founded there Grupo Novo Horizonte, a group whose legacy is still felt in Brazilian classical music today. They have to their name 105 works, of which 42 were commissioned by them. It is a really startling Anglo-Brazilian story. It's also a really interesting post-Fires of London story, because there was no tradition of reviewing classical concerts in Sao Paulo, no cycle of promotion, reception, and creation that we rely on and as take for granted, and that is so crucial to sustaining contemporary musical life. There were also, and still is, a very high turnover of musicians. Many musicians studied, performed, or taught abroad, and that's a challenge for any group seeking consistency and chemistry, an acute one for an ensemble trying to prepare new music on a regular basis. Even so, Grupo Novo Horizonte fostered this very much internationalist ethos in their programming and their collaborations, and they created a body of Brazilian music that supported a generation of emerging composers. And if that sounds familiar, well, of course, Pierrot players and the Fires of London had done likewise in the 70s and 80s. Here is the group. You'll notice some brass instruments. They did branch out, much like Maxwell Davis did with the Lighthouse, adorning the ensemble even more with brass, becoming almost more like a London Sinfonietta, one of each type lineup by the end. But here is just a selection of the works that they created. Harry Kroll's Pierrot ensemble here was the first. The group were going to start out life as like Tashi. I don't know if you've heard of Tashi, the new music group, but they are based around Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time lineup. But Harry Kroll persuaded Graham to add an instrument, and hence the Pierrot ensemble was born. And there are 3 of the works that they commissioned for Pierrot Quintet. And as they went on, others followed, much as they did with the Fires of London. They were only operational from 1988 to 1999. Nevertheless, a lot of works were created. We'll come to this quote to finish with in a moment. So, forgive me. Yeah, this quote here is really the most striking connection between the Brazilian group and the Fires of London, because the Fires did this tour in 1977 of Central and South America. There is a whole article devoted to it, written by Judy Arnold in the themed issue of Tempo from, I think, 1983. I think Nick might be able to correct me on that later on. But there's a whole article devoted to the Fires tour of South America. They gave 18 concerts in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, including 4 in Sao Paulo, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, and Curitiba. Present at the third of these Brazilian concerts was a young Maurizio de Torre, who would write several pieces for Grupo Novo Horizonte. This connection, I mean, let's read this quote together, shall we? When I was 16, I attended a concert in Rio to hear the Fires of London, playing Pierrot Lunaire with the soprano Mary Thomas, dressed in black, a crescent silver moon painted on her face, just a shaft of blue light on her, the other musicians playing in the dark. It was the first and by far the best time I'd heard Pierrot live. I thought at the end of the concert, I want to learn to compose, to write music as beautiful as that. Schoenberg is always with me, even if I write music of a very different style. And I mean, it goes further, these coincidences, because de Torre then went to study in Wales and formed a connection with a Cardiff-based ensemble called the PM Music Ensemble. I'm sorry, I don't know what PM stands for, but they were a Pierrot quintet founded in 1991 by Peter Reynolds, who died a few years ago. I don't know a huge amount about that group. In fact, I've told you everything I know about that group. But nevertheless, that is a remarkable connection, that de Torre not only then heard the Fires of London in Brazil, but then came to study in Cardiff. And so this Anglo-Brazilian story carried on. To conclude, because I'm conscious of the time, I will stop sharing now and talk to you directly. The Pierrot Ensemble has undergone a century of formation, variation, and continuation. My pluralistic categorizing approach admits that it would be quite unnatural for Pierrot, however chameleonic its content and performance history, to forever exemplify features that were to become typical of a class of Pierrot ensembles. So Pierrot remains a prototype, spawning this vast lineage of Pierrot ensembles. And just as some composers come to the lineup not through Schoenberg, but through David or through a contemporary Pierrot ensemble, musicologists must do likewise. We have to aim towards a more joined-up understanding of the ensemble. We need to survey further works. We need to explore its effects on local concert scenes if we're to codify the medium globally. Speaking of a Fires sextet, today arguably means less than it once did to most, at least compared with the last century. But the positive conclusion to draw from that is that it's the diversity and the heritage of the Pierrot ensembles, and above all their proliferation and new music friendliness, that have made it so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That really was a fascinating discussion and really illuminating in many ways. You mentioned Maurizio there. I actually knew Maurizio. He was doing his PhD when I was doing my master's, I think. So I remember Maurizio actually. And I remember the PM ensemble very vividly. Peter Reynolds was always around Cardiff. He was one of those characters, and as you say, unfortunately, he died a few years ago. I don't know what PM stands for. I wish I asked him, but I'm not entirely sure. But in some of the people who played in the PM ensemble actually played in Music Theatre Wales, as Michael Rafferty and people like that, and Lynn Plowman, who is now a very well-established Welsh composer. So yes, it's brought back lots of memories there. So thank you. And maybe someone's got a question about the legacy of the Fires ensemble, and that's what you've been talking about there in Brazil is just one the I'm guessing lots and lots of kind of offshoots of the legacy of that. I just want to go back to Max before we open the floor for questions. I've just got a very it's a kind of an observation really, but it might be a question. I haven't formulated it quite yet, but I think we all agree that we can't really underestimate the profound influence of the work Pierrot Lunaire by Schoenberg on Max, and particularly his music theatre pieces from the 1960s. And I've just dug out a quote from Max, and this is taken from a BBC Radio 3 broadcast from 1969. And it was at a concert at Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. And he was performing with the Pierrot players and Mary Thomas. And he told the audience that, and I quote, "Pierrot Lunaire was one of the great revelations when I was at school. I was absolutely taken by the extension of the expression of musical experience. This so tied with the reading I was doing of Freud and Jung, and I was very, very fascinated, not only in the music, but the way that Schoenberg had found the possibility of finding a music to equate the nightmare world, which was expressed in the texts of Pierrot Lunaire." So he goes on to talk about the nightmarish world and the grotesqueness in the instrumental writing and also in the vocal writing as well. And I'm sure we can all sort of hear those echoes in Revelation and Fall, and right the way through to 8 songs as well. Perhaps I just pass over to Richard here, because Richard, I think you've got a quote from Max's diary, haven't you, from 1948, where he talks about Pierrot Lunaire and Schoenberg.
Well, thanks, Nick. I haven't got it to hand here because I didn't look it up when you texted me. But in the diary, I think it was from May 1948, so he'd be 14. Yeah, and coming on 14. He writes, they heard Schoenberg, Pierrot Lunaire, so that would be for the first time. And his comment is simply, "I admire Schoenberg." And that's it. But certainly 1948 is when he had. I'll see if I can find it, see if there's any else.
Thanks. My question, I'm coming to my question now, Chris, sorry. You mentioned expressionism and neo-expressionism, post-expressionism, whatever you want to call it in terms of relation to Max's music from the 60s. I'm just wondering, did other composers pick up to the same extent as Max on those kind of buzzwords and labels that we have now put on that kind of music, or was Max kind of unique, do you think? I mean, how widespread was it?
I don't think they did. I think that is quite unique to Max, in that one of the questions I have to ask myself a lot looking at this is, okay, so how do we separate medium and genre? Where do they overlap? Where don't they overlap? And by and large, they don't. By and large, composers don't think too much about the continuation of a specific genre when they're necessarily writing for a medium, or perhaps they wish to circumvent it because there is this grand tradition of Schoenberg and Max. So if you've got that expressionist, neo-expressionist legacy, then perhaps you want to completely leave that behind and say, well, that's been done. So be it. I'm going to now write my thing. I mean, some of the most momentous, well-remembered Pierrot ensembles after this era would be, and I did mention him, but I didn't mention the work, Elliott Carter's Triple Duo, which is probably one of the most performed Pierrot ensembles, especially in America. Got absolutely nothing to do with expressionism, but all to do with the way in which they use the instruments, inspired by Max and Schoenberg and permutations of instruments and different families played off against one another. Quite similar to the Reich we heard, actually, a world away aesthetically, but quite similar in their approach to the sub-families of instruments. So I think my hunch would be, and speaking to composers, this bears it out, is that they want to compose something original, and therefore, by and large, they want to eschew that tradition. We respect that it exists, but can write something different. The problem for them, or opportunity, depending on how you see it, is that if they're writing for Pierrot ensemble, they are inevitably going to be prolonging tradition, aren't they? And so I suspect most of them think, well, I'm going to prolong the medium because I've been asked to do this, but I'm not necessarily going to invest myself in expressionism and neo-expressionism. And the final point is that there were some quite unkind words written about Max's neo-expressionism in the 60s in the journals, quite aloof and haughty, but there were serious questions asked about why he was resurrecting expressionism in the 60s when this was supposed to be attached to the 1910s and 20s. There's one particular one, I forget the author now, but no, it's not coming back to me, but definitely around 1970 in the Musical Times, someone writing a whole article about Max saying, well, what's he doing this for? He shouldn't be resurrecting something that belongs in the past, which I think is wrong. I think, of course, you can write in a neo-expressionist way 50 years after Schoenberg. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
That was that was in response to the symphonic genre, wasn't it? I think I seem to remember. Sally, you've got your hand up.
I was just reminded about the whole thing with the Schoenberg Chamber Symphony, which is what the London Sinfonietta is based on. And again, composers really, really didn't want to be limited to that lineup after the first kind of, spark of those early commissions. They wanted to get away from that grid, and that's natural. It's natural. But, Max is defined by those works, and British music is defined by them too, in an extraordinary way.
I don't know what the rest of you think, but I think sometimes with the works are so well remembered and so fondly remembered, the earlier works, that I wish that some of his later Pierrot ensembles were better known. I mean, one of my absolute favourites is Winterfold from 1986, is it? One of the last works he wrote for the Fires of London. Absolutely beautiful, quite melancholy and introspective, not something you necessarily associate with Max, but not to my knowledge been picked up by Pierrot ensembles afterwards. I'm not sure if it's had a second, third performance yet, but perhaps that's still for musicologists to go out and revive these and to make them well known.
But I mean, Ave Maria Stella is just, I think, almost the greatest of them all, isn't it? I mean, it's an incredible piece.
Yeah, it's very beautiful.
Yeah, those pieces he wrote for the Fires in the 80s, yes, they do need somebody to look at those in more detail. Richard, I think you've got
I've got the quote now.
Quote, haven't you?
We should never rely on memory entirely. It was the 8th of November, 1949, and he writes exactly, "Tonight heard Pierrot Lunaire by Schoenberg, a truly moving work, but it goes too fast to realize fully. I admire Schoenberg."
There we go.
It would be really interesting to know which performance you'd heard. I'm trying to think. I mean, there were some LPs around, some 33s around at that time. Because
I would think that's radio. Well, he was buying records at that time, so it could have been that. But the way he says, "I heard," suggests that he either had a performance. I don't think it was. I think it was possibly radio. That's the most likely, I think.
Yeah. I mean, so I wonder if it's that ISCM performance that I was mentioning from Palermo, because there weren't that many performances around. The striking thing about researching Benjamin Britten, again with the diaries, is you can literally go in and know exactly which performance he was listening to on the radio and know exactly which concert he's referring to. So it's a really micro lineage at that point, very easy to research in that sense. Literally every concert and performance means something, and has a direct cause and effect upon the composer.
Has anyone got any questions that you'd like to ask Chris about his talk? Or
Chris, you don't mention Sandy Gurr. He wasn't part of the Fires, but he was doing music theatre at the same time as the Fires.
He was, yeah. I'm going to look in my index now. He wrote the Suite, Opus 11. Yeah, he didn't write a Pierrot ensemble. That's probably why. Very cruel of me not to.
Actually, the Suite Opus 11. It's an interesting one because Sandy himself told me that Britten asked him to write. He'd written, some pretty stringent, shall we say, pieces, big pieces, Hecuba's Lament and a violin concerto and things like that. And Britten asked him to write a piece for the Aldeburgh Festival, and the lineup was flute and harp and clarinet. And Sandy said, "I don't write pieces like that." And Britten said, "No, and that's why I'm asking you to do so." I thought, it's a beautiful piece, actually. If you don't know it, it's a really gorgeous piece.
Do. He wrote it for the Suite. He wrote it for the Melos Ensemble, which isn't off the top of my head. I just looked it up in my book. But they were a slightly bigger ensemble. Usually, they did do Pierrot, but normally it was a slightly bigger mixed winds and strings ensemble. So he wrote that. But no, he didn't have any direct engagement with the Pierrot players or the Fires of London, but he did with other ensembles.
But I think the music theatre pieces he was writing, the first one, what's it called? Naples Vineyard and Shadowplay. I mean, they are, I think, in the same. They're not expressionist because he wasn't expressionist, but they are, shall we say, astringent works, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're trying to clear away a lot of crap.
Yeah. One of the really interesting themes for me, and again comes down to kind of composer psychology here, is to what extent Max and Harry, and later Max on his own, were trying to engage their compatriots. Now, it might sound like a daft question because, of course, they were commissioning composers all the time, normally younger composers, but they'd never. I mean, I'm not blaming Max at all for this, but they didn't seek out Lutyens' concertante for 5 players or anything. There was no kind of like camaraderie-ness there. I mean, Lutyens was a very difficult character by all accounts, so that's probably a lot to do with it. And she wasn't at all complimentary about her forebears either. So there's some interesting, let's put it that way, interesting interpersonal difficulties here between the different generations, and of course between Max and Harry, the elephant in the room.
On that note, have we any other questions? Yes, Brian.
Just a really quick one. What's the title of your book?
Oh, it's simply The Pierrot Ensembles, Chronicle and Catalogue, 1912 to 2012.
Perfect.
So it goes.
I shall look it up.
And it's Plumbago 2013?
It is.
Correct?
That's right. Yeah.
But if you want to...
Yeah, no, I shouldn't be saying this because it prevents you buying the book. But if you want to go and get a free, if you're assuming you can get to JSTOR, there is. I wrote an article on the Brazilian group Grupo Novo Horizonte for Tempo about 4 or 5 years ago. So there's an article on them as well. There's also a chapter on Britain's Pierrot ensembles in a book called British Music and Modernism. So there are a few publications out there, not just my book.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. So let's draw the session to a close. So thank you once again, Chris, for a really, really great talk, very fascinating, and it really puts the Pierrot ensemble and the Fires of London into a kind of a broader context, which I really valued, so thank you again. And thank you for everyone for attending this talk. And Richard and I look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks again.
Just a quickie, because I've been looking it up. This is under it's Wikipedia, but it says the Schoenberg made test recordings of the music September 1940. These recordings were eventually released on LP by Columbia Records in 1949.
That's right. Yeah.
So
yeah, I got that LP.
That's what he could have heard. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Richard. No, that's okay. That was a nice postscript, so thank you. Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, bye now.